Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this episode. Seems like trying to make this first episode over the last few weeks has been a bit of a complete palaver, because the way that the world is moving right now, it seems to be moving at breakneck pace, so it's becoming increasingly impossible to get a gauge on events in the moment. But I'm going to try and give what I think is an interesting take on the future of the West as somebody who lives in China. Now, you're probably looking at the title of this video and thinking, this is just inflammatory, you're just trying to do this to get clicks, but I can assure you I'm not some kind of Chinese sleeper agent on YouTube, the kind of person paid 2 yuan to spread propaganda on Western sites, and I'm not what you would call a big proponent of the Chinese-style dictatorship either. But I'm going to try and talk to you over the course of this video on why I think that, worryingly, the Chinese state is looking like the model that will become a rival superpower to US hegemony, even after 4 years of hostile Trump presidency. The first thing I think we ought to clear up, honestly, is the Western perception that Chinese is a communist state, something akin to what the Soviet Union was like as a rival against US in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Well, guess what, guys? Regardless of what the Chinese Communist Party says, or the People's Republic of China claims to be, China is not some kind of Soviet Union too with Chinese people. And it hasn't been this way for a long time. And I think that this misconception comes because the regime after Mao was a lot like this. It was a carbon copy of Stalinist tyranny, just under Mao's leadership. But after his death in 1976, really this nation has been doing everything it possibly can to get away from that model, because it basically crippled the country and weakened the people to the point where they were one of the weakest economies in Asia, irrespective of the fact that they were also the most popular country by a massive margin. I also think that this ludicrous perception that the Chinese nation is some kind of Soviet Union-esque model makes it very easy for the Chinese to dupe the West, because the US, and to a lesser extent the Europeans, think that they have defeated the Soviet Union, that communism is done, that after 1991 the Soviet Union is dead and there's no more communist enemies in the world. And this kind of complacency makes it quite easy for a seriously strong nation like China to sneak under the radar and, to a lesser extent as well, present itself as a friend to the capitalists, whilst also pursuing its own goals completely under the eyes of the Western powers. And I think that nothing shows this more, to be honest, than the prevalence of Chinese goods in Western economies and the amount of Chinese investment in Western economies, which the Western governments have only recently come to the realization that they are surrounded by Chinese investment, who pursue a goal that is completely alien to theirs. And I find it very difficult to deal with the Western economists going completely ballistic over the growth of the Chinese economy, because anyone who thinks about it for any extended period of time will come to the same realization that I have, that this kind of growth was ultimately inevitable. I mean, China had been the most populous nation in Southeast Asia, rivaling India to some extent, for the best part of 5 millennia. So the fact that it was so suppressed in growth should be the surprising part, not the growth of its capitalism. The Chinese leadership since the 70s has been making the greatest effort it can to keep growing the Chinese economy at 8 to 10% every month. And it's only recently that that's dropped off. And I think that this is in large part because they're saturated their own economy to this point. There's no area of Chinese economy where they can't pump money into this free debt that is quite dangerous, but ultimately is what's driving that 8% growth every month. I mean, it seems crazy to me that people look at the Chinese economy and go, wow, this is incredible, this is something completely new. If anyone who takes a cursory look at Chinese policy throughout the 50s and 60s will know that Mao ran his country into the ground trying to use human resource as a way of overcoming industrial setbacks, and to the extent that he basically destroyed the local economies of China and starved millions of people to death. So the progress after the 1970s, it seems like the Chinese government could have put pretty much minimal effort into it in avoiding Maoism and still come out as a succeeding and growing economy. And going back to this point that people cry that here comes the communists back, we're gonna redo the Cold War again, guys, it's Cold War II Electric Boogaloo, except this time it's not Russian people, it's Han Chinese people. It's just completely missing the mark with the Chinese, because since Stalin's death, the Chinese had always been at rival with Russia. Regardless of the fact that they were both communist, the Chinese went behind the Russians' back to get the bomb after the Russians refused to give it to them. The Chinese also tried to cement Asian allies outside of Russian Soviet influence. And Nixon's offer in the 1980s or the 1970s, apologies if I get that wrong, Nixon's offer just looks like another opportunity for the Chinese to stick it to the Russians again and show that China's an important country. And let's face it, China is an important country. It always has been in Asia. If you look at the chain of history, the recent 2 centuries, both in the 20th and the 19th century, are both blips on the Chinese radar. They're both blips where China isn't the hegemon that it had been for the past 5 millennia. And again, we have to come back to the point that this is not like the Soviet Union, because the Soviets always had a problem with poor standards of living throughout the 70s and 80s, and to a lesser extent the actual collapse of the Soviet Union was from the inside. It had to reform to improve the terrible living standard of its inhabitants. I mean, Peter Hitchens talks about it in his book, about how the lifestyle is awful even in the late period of the Soviet Union, and they constantly have to exercise hard power to keep the Soviet state in line and keep the people on side. And the Chinese just don't need to do this anymore. I know which moment you're thinking of, the thing that never happened in July 1989. But that was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. That wasn't even in my lifetime. And most of the Chinese prosperity has come after that point. All the Chinese people here are invested in the system. They're doing well. Their living standard has only gone up since the complete destruction throughout the 50s and 60s. So they're really not looking to overthrow this regime. They're doing fantastically well. I mean, the Chinese are taught all the way through school, almost insistently once a year, about the embarrassments of the 19th and the 20th century and how this will never happen again. We will never be subjected to Western powers again, which is fantastic for them in terms of geopolitical influence, because they know that they should never get too deep in bed with the British or with the Americans or with the Europeans, because inevitably it will lead to some exploitation, and they always want for these for any treaty and for any agreement that's made with the Western powers to be more in their favour than in the West. This is never about an equal opportunities agreement where the Chinese get in as much as the West get out of it. They want for a surplus gain on their side. And whether that's hard power or soft power geopolitically, they will take whatever they can get. And the problem really comes as well that irrespective of it being complete propaganda that the Chinese government has all 1.6 billion people on side, because we've seen, I'm sure you've seen on the internet somewhere, some laughable lol cow Chinese person making a derogatory comment on some Chinese social network, and the Western people are like, ha ha ha, that undermines the whole regime. How could the regime even stand up as one person has made a joke on Weibo? That would just completely collapse the Chinese Communist government. Irrespective of these tiny blips of rebellion on social media by teenagers who have a rebellious streak in them, the Chinese have vast unity in their own nation, with a population that is almost 5 times that of America's. So they have social cohesion and social unity in a country that's 5 times as big as America. And even in my own home country of the UK, we can't manage that at the moment. We have our own problems with social cohesion and problems with overwhelming amounts of immigration that don't integrate into the population. To the Chinese, this looks great. The entirety of their opposition is weakened. And that's not even taken into account what I'm about to go into. Because the real problem that the biggest mistake the West has made with dealing with the Chinese is that they thought that they could just take the money that the Chinese made and take their goods and pay into the Chinese system and not expect them to bite them in the arse later down the line. For a country that expels Western hatred from all its ancient tourist attractions, a quick visit to the Summer Palace at Beijing will teach Westerners what the attitude of the Chinese government is to the West, which, if for anyone who doesn't know, during the Opium Wars, the British and the French burned down the ancient Summer Palace, and the Chinese make no expense to make sure that anyone who visits this palace is well aware that the reason that it's not there is entirely the West's fault. And I can't understand the hubris that came from Western leaders when they thought that they could take billions of dollars of investment from Chinese business investors and think that that wouldn't come with strings attached, or that wouldn't possibly undermine their authority. You only have to take a look at the numbers that are eye-wateringly high for investment in the US, the UK, Australia, Europe. All of these places have taken massive gains from Chinese investment, and they didn't even think that it might perhaps be in their interest to regulate this. I mean, how weak and how deluded do you have to be to think you're just the total global hegemons, that you could take, for instance, the UK could take $50 billion of Chinese investment, and that wouldn't possibly undermine the British economy if and when it came to hostile relations with a government that is totally opposed to them. And if anybody was ever in any doubt that the situation was coming, the whole situation right now with the coup has just proven that the West is at odds with China and outsourcing all manufacturing to a regime that constantly espouses its opposition to Western demagoguery. It's laughable. It's honestly laughable. How comfortable did we get? How comfortable did we get, like the boiling frog in the water, before it came to thousands of people dying from an infectious disease, and the Chinese say, well, we have to protect our own, so we can't send you manufacturing. How did it come to this point before the Western governments woke up and saw that this was not in their favour, that the whole geopolitical stage had changed, and even organisations like the WHO and the United Nations had been bought on side for the communist regime? And I honestly think that the next 4 years is only going to get worse, because a certain person who has just been put in the highest place of power and the representative for the free democracies of the West has always said that he would take friendly relationships with the Chinese, that really the Chinese just needed a friendly hand to deal with them. And this, again, is utter complacency to a regime that has it's already been found that they've infected areas of the American state. To a lesser extent, Trump had some successes. He did minimalize the amount of government-controlled Chinese institutions there were on US soil. He had revealed the extent to which the Chinese government was spying on the US population. And then the next president comes out and says that we're going to take a friendly approach to a regime that is spying on us, that is manipulating us, and that is taking advantage of us to improve its own strength. And honestly, if there's one thing that I would like people to take out from this video, is that if the boog does happen, if there is no political solution to the problems that currently exist in the West, and that this continual globalist idea will continue to flourish in the West, the Chinese will love it, because it plays into their hands. Liberal democracy is constantly proving that it cannot deal with a strong totalitarian government in the face of it. And in the past, the democracies have had to take a more totalitarian stance to overcome its rivals in the past. But can you honestly see that situation can possibly play out in America anymore? The social unity in America is reaching highs that we haven't seen in the US since the 1860s. And the Europeans are having their own issues that they created with the mass migration crisis, which is currently severing popular support for middle parties in favour of the extremes. We've never seen politics reach more extreme wings than now. And the Chinese is continuing to more unify its people with growth. All throughout coronavirus, they've had good PR. And in the face of it, the West has not only suffered thousands of deaths, but complete political uprising too, which to the Chinese people makes it look like the state is collapsing. Now, the issue really is, as well, that the Chinese cannot afford to play the long game anymore. And I think I'll go into this in more depth in another video, but really the Chinese need to be looking to overthrow and become a global superpower to rival the US before 2030 or 2040, due to a plethora of factors that I'll try not to go into too much depth in this video. I honestly think that if the West wants to keep going in its current form, if it wants to be the bastion of freedom and democracy, they really need to choose whether globalism is the mantra that they do it under, a tactic that is constantly playing into the hands of the Chinese regime, or whether they accept that they have to bend the knee to their own population to overcome foreign adversaries. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you very much.